So with that, I'd actually like to bring up our panelists. Come on up. Next up, we have DAOs using NFTs as a force for good. And so with that, I will hand it over. You've got the three of you. Hello, sir. Look at this. We had a great dinner. You're fantastic. You're good. So you guys have a seat. You're going to have a panel conversation. Do you want me to ask any questions?
Yeah, do your thing.
Yeah, I know. This is fantastic. All right. Well, great. Well, fantastic. So would each of you just introduce yourselves, and then we can go from there?
Sure. GM. My name is Kelsey Driscoll. I'm the Chief Social Impact Officer at ChangeDAO, which is an NFT marketplace for change art. And we build tools for change makers to create movements in Web3. Great to be here.
Cool. Hey everybody, I'm Brian Brinkman. I'm an artist in the space, but I'm also a spokes artist and advisor for ChangeDAO. But yeah, I've been in the space for a while. I've been dropping art on Super Rare, Nifty Gateway, Art Blocks, Async, and now looking to further find ways to, and in the future, ChangeDAO, and find awesome ways to use NFTs for good.
Hi, name is John Klippinger. I'm with the MIT Media Lab. I've been there about 12 years at the City Science Group, and before that, the Human Dynamics Group. Even before MIT, I was at Harvard at the Brinkman Center, ran something called the law lab, in which we did computational law. More recently, I've been very interested in issues around climate change and how do you create the financial incentives to transition from a fossil economy to a nature-backed economy where you can have verification of proof of improvement of the state of nature. So I started a company in Zug, Switzerland, and it's called ClearTrace, and that's now going, and now I'm helped start a foundation called Open Earth Foundation, where we're developing an open infrastructure to enable people to do accounting and climate accounting across different kind of domains, just not carbon sequestration, but also biodiversity. We're looking at a new kind of DAO that's based upon a new kind of AI that actually issues and mints and burns tokens based upon proof of state of nature. So we might talk about that.
Well, this is fantastic. What a great group of individuals. So maybe first we should kick off and talk about what are some of the core principles or rationale or requirements that are needed for when we say how NFTs are used in DAOs for public good. There must be certain guiding principles that use those requirements, and maybe just talk about those before we get into some specific use cases.
Could you rephrase that question? What are our values as a DAO, or what makes something a DAO?
What's the overarching principles that you use to help determine how NFTs are used as a force for good in DAOs?
Oh, okay, so for ChangeDAO specifically, we curate change makers, and we have 5 core values that we follow: trust, accountability, et cetera, et cetera. But really what we're doing is looking and to identify the change makers and how and empower them to use NFTs how they would like to use them. For example, we don't force change makers or artists to tithe. If you are minting on our marketplace, we think art in and of itself as an NFT is social change. It is a force for change in and of itself. But we also provide sovereign smart contracts so that change makers can bring on collaborators, social impact DAOs, other organizations that they would like to include in the provenance of the blockchain in their movement and build that way as well. So I think when we use change, not good. I think good is really relative. I think change is more accurate, and what type of change you want to make in the world. NFTs can be used for that simply by being a great moving piece of art, or they can be functional in the way that you can transfer capital from those who have to those who have not. So I think it's kind of a broad spectrum of what change you want to make in the world, what social impact you want to make, and how you can use Web3 as a tool and a technology for that to happen. In the DAO context, I mean, it can take many forms. We're still figuring that out, but we are following the principles right now and exploring the principles of the co-op model. So if you're familiar with REI or agriculture co-ops or even like housing co-ops, it's about joint decision making and sharing that profit. And so we're looking to these operational models that are financially inclusive and empowering kind of across the board to integrate into Web3.
That's fantastic. Yeah, please. Go for it.
Yeah, this is a great question. One of the things we've been really interested in new kind of governance models. And how do you have decentralized governance and the fact that something can't get captured? And the whole point of a public good is that it's owned for the benefit of the public. But the problem is, in too many cases, what you have is something of a great value is created, and then it's captured by certain groups, whales or whatever you want to create. And so it's very difficult to actually create the alignment of the right incentives in order to keep it a public good. And my view on this, and this is where we're moving, and it's pretty controversial in some sense, is that a lot of the minting and burning and the allocation, the whole governance principles themselves are algorithmic and based upon certain principles actually out of physics, what something called free energy principle. So we really want to make something as independent and verifiable and transparent and that generates any kind of value that does not get captured by an internal group. And that could be early funders, it could be investors, it could be whales. So there's a huge design challenge here, and it's been with us forever. Who guards the guards? You know, it's a classic governance problem. And I think it's one of the things that needs to be solved, is yet to be solved.
Yeah, well, you guys both summed it up very well. And Kelsey already touched a lot on ChangeDAO, but I think when I think about DAOs, it's often, you know, communities that are like-minded and rallying around the same ideas. And for ChangeDAO and for kind of using creators and artists to create for good, I love the idea of using the ChangeDAO as a way to kind of bring people together that are creating art to talk about causes they care about and elevate those, and then as participants we can all work together and then become a part of this DAO and build everybody up and all these causes together. And so that's kind of the outlook I look at it as a creator.
So aside from the projects that each of you are working on, can you think of some examples that are actually doing this really well? How NFTs are being utilized, how DAOs are working well in spaces that maybe are adjacent to yours or even in the same space. Particularly, you know, the question of how we fund. Perhaps things, maybe I'll start. I'll just give you a quick example. So Gitcoin. So Gitcoin is a marketplace that enables developers and designers to receive funding for the projects that they want to work on. There's a lot of conversations around governance structures that set up concepts of retroactive distribution in relation to public goods projects. Many times, as these projects begin to kick off, there isn't necessarily the clear end case for the determination on monetization or where and how value is going to accrue. Yet many projects in our space require these core infrastructures as a way of actually working and completing. And so you have this concept of, well, a bit of a chicken and egg. How do you actually get them started and ensure that they're properly funded without knowing a clear path that ends up happening in the ways in which they ultimately accrue value to them, and therefore the original funders or the original individuals that seek to support them. So the concepts of retroactive distribution for public goods is something that Gitcoin works on and focuses on. Personally, that's one that I think works incredibly well, particularly in our space. But then pass it over to you for other examples, the ways in which you can see public goods DAOs working.
Well, actually, I'll talk about a DAOs, and then I'll actually talk about an example that's not a DAO that actually we're modeling ourselves and looking at. So I think the idea that what we're looking at is the concept of how the community can own the economy. And so, I mean, you see that in Axie Infinity. There's an attempt, and there are interesting failures in how to do that. And again, it's a question of capture. But I think this concept of a community owning the means by the way that wealth is created and distributed is very important, and how do you create transparency and how do you augment that? Now, one of the interesting examples in quote, the real world is a Vanguard. It's a mutual fund. And John Bogle, the founder of that, this is many years ago, he made the decision that unlike Fidelity, he was going to build something that was going to be owned by the shareholders. So this is right now, I think it's like a $6-7 trillion. I think it's the largest mutual fund. But what's interesting about it is that it's an index fund. Its mandate is to reduce the cost of managing funds, have multiple funds that are owned by the shareholders. So the whole Vanguard itself is owned by its shareholders. And there's a very thin management layer. So it's not a self-serving managing layer because they have a particular mandate. And so this idea of being able to have a very explicit mission that is measurable and have the benefits accrue to the people who own it, I think is an interesting model that shows it can be scaled. It can show that it can outcompete the more traditional models. So I think we can look to those and then say how we can augment that in the digital world.
I love that. By the way, just real quick on that, is it then you would view, say, Vanguard as a mutual fund that acts as probably a large component of retirement as a public good, the notion of being able to provide the sense of savings as a public good?
Well, I mean, it's not that we would use Vanguard itself. I mean, as a model is what I'm saying. Is so that that idea of basically having extremely low management fees, and they have each of the funds, the multiple funds, their own the ownership of it. So you can say, well, there may be many kinds. We're looking at many different tokens for different kinds of communities. They each can own themselves, but they're part of a larger effort that is driving towards a particular end. And our end is being able to create a sustainable planet, which means that we have to have measurable means of showing that we actually achieve these outcomes and they have real value and they create liquidity within other market segments.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a lot of DAOs kind of have this short-sighted outlook of like, let's raise a bunch of money and buy something, and then once they get it, then they're like, okay, now what do we do with it? And there's no way to like drive any more value. But one example that I think was really interesting and successful was Super Rare. About a year ago, they kind of took their company, they turned it into a DAO. They gave all of the collectors and artists tokens that had ownership of it, and it solved a lot of different problems. Mainly one was curation. It allowed artists to curate and bring on groups of artists based on philanthropy or like Mexican artists specifically, and like kind of bring on new ways of curating the platform. And then they've also taken those tokens and used it as a way to monetize businesses to come on and collaborate with them and say, well, if you're going to join us, then you have to subscribe to our tokens and drive value going forward. So I think they're an interesting example of someone that has not just had a short-sighted view, but has continued to build upon that, basically giving back to the community.
Yeah, I actually think about this from a social impact perspective. I think there's lots of examples like Vanguard in the financial space, Super Rare with the marketplace space. But I think we see these flashpoints with a lot of DAOs that are like, we're going to go buy this thing, Constitution DAO, for example, or Free Ross DAO, right? We're gonna go and we're gonna buy this thing, and then once that flashpoint is done, then you could just kind of have a bunch of people here being like, okay, what now? And I think that we haven't solved that for this space yet, but it's a real opportunity area of how do you capture that momentum, build on it, and create movements, and sustainable movements that aren't just a blip on the radar in the media and then they disappear. Because when we talk about social impact, that's not what's happening direct service on the ground. And so I mentioned the co-op model before, and I think it's really interesting for DAOs to adopt that operational model of how do we give our shareholders 50% of the wallet or a share of the wallet, have them govern it. What we run into in a lot of DAOs, or what I've seen running into a lot of DAOs, is that you have this the same problem you have with representative democracy. You have all these people in the room, but they don't want to really participate or vote in every single decision. So I think that the models that we're trying to drill down on, and I think that will be successful for social impact DAOs in the future, will be this long-term sustainable model of how do you continuously keep people engaged in a way that they want to be engaged, not just giving away their voting rights to someone else because they don't have time or interest in voting on every single decision. So I think, there's a fine line between just, the apathy of representational democracy and real meaningful participation from your community and community building.
Yeah, that's great. I think another one I'd want to be curious of your thoughts too. So at Consensus Mesh, we participate in Unicorn DAO, which was founded by some of the members of Pussy Riot, and the focus, and they actually had created Ukraine DAO as well. And so our participation in there is to help advance and advocate for women and queer-led NFT projects, an underrepresented class or group in this NFT realm. So from a social impact perspective, the goal there is to actually help advocate that. And the challenge is, then I say, and we think about this ourselves, is how do we actually go through the process of advancing that? Like you've highlighted some of the challenges in terms of apathy, but is it what are those concrete steps from a solutions perspective? Is it education? Yeah, please go for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a design problem, right? Like that we're all working in an emerging market to figure out how how to function in an economy, organize in an economy, community organize in an economy that is separate from a political system. And I think we're just feeling it out. We're figuring it out as the infrastructure comes up around us. But the design statement is, how do you get people to participate meaningfully over time in a sustainable way? And that's been the design statement for any type of community organizing since the beginning of time. It just so happens that Web3 allows us to do that across boundaries, across cultures, across different groups of people, geographies, et cetera. So I think it's an exciting time, and I'm sorry that is not a direct answer.
It's tough. It's a really tough. I mean, I was going to say, I think if think through some questions. Think through some comments as well, because we're going to have a little bit of time from the audience. So that would be great. But yeah, please. I know it is. It's difficult.
Yeah, no, it's a super difficult question. But it's how do you align incentives, I think, at the end of the day. And we have seen a bunch of different ways to do that, but it's how do you look at all of the different industry sectors, take those best practices for participation and aligning incentives in a positive way so that you're creating the impact that you want to create, and not these perverse incentives where it ends up just kind of mirroring the other markets that have traditionally left out a lot of people.
Yeah, I think a lot of it probably goes down to using a portion of the budget for marketing, like you're saying, education, visibility, giving a spotlight on both the project and the artist is the best way to kind of break through the noise of the space and give them the attention they need.
I mean, we have this. We also work with a group called Regen Network. It was in the regenerative finance area, and part of this is creating an incentive system for farmers and in forestry and preserve natural resources. And what we're designing is a means by which people can contribute data, and then because you have to have, if you're making certain claims about being able to preserving natural resources, you need to have some benchmark about where the state of it is, and then and so if we're doing that, we have also a method that verifies the quality of the data, the risk associated with the data. So there's a data and there's a term of the fidelity that goes with that. Then we also have people contribute models, and the model, I mean, is the prediction of an impact on that particular area. So if it be in forestry or soil conservation or in marine life, there's certain measures you can take and models you take, and how good those models are then actually reward people. They actually issue tokens, which goes to a treasury token over a period of time. That's really is what a nature-backed securities, or token, I should say, is about. And then actually that creates liquidity within a local marketplace. So we're actually working with different developing countries that have these phenomenal natural resources that are being extracted, exploited, destroyed, and saying, how can we create the incentive to preserve that and reflect their real value, and then attract capital from fiat capital into that world and be contained and create liquidity in that world. So it's an ongoing system. And basically what you're doing is you're creating a new kind of economics. And that's a new set of incentives about actually doing good for the planet, preserving the planet, and creating equity. So it's actually, we're using, there's some modeling language. I know people are familiar with things like machinations that design token economies and things like that. So we're simulating different kind of incentive structures to see how well they work, and then what are the things that undermine them, and how can we compensate for that.
I got nothing to add on that one.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. I thought you were gonna.
Oh yeah, I was just, it comes down to what we were saying. Like, it comes down to the architecture, and for social impact DAOs specifically that have like a mission, a specific mission. Another tactic that I actually learned from some of the greatest leaders in the space is to have a veto-only advisory board. So when you have decision by committee, you have that control. So the advisory board cannot actually come up with different propositions to be voted on by the DAO, but they can say that's actually not really aligned with our mission, or that's going to undermine our sustainability or whatever, and they can have veto power. So I think when we talk about decentralization, it's always like, well, pure decentralization. There are centralized pieces of DAOs because it's really hard to create a product by committee. And so I think at the end of the day, like for ChangeDAO, for example, we're taking the long view of progressive decentralization and figuring out step by step without exiting to our community too soon to where they don't know what they want to do with the actual product or whatever or project that we're doing. So I think, taking the long view in a market that is constantly like this and you always feel like you're behind is something that takes discipline, but in the longevity of a DAO, intention, not move fast and break things, but intentionally building architecture and intentional design is super important.
So before some of the final comments I have or questions I have for you, I was just wondering if there are any questions or comments from the audience, perhaps around, say, specific DAOs that are doing public goods work that are part of these conversations. Do we have any questions, thoughts? No? Oh, yeah, go for it. Yeah, oh, here. I'll come down, look at this. I'm like, yeah, how you doing? I'm Oprah.
Oh, wow, in person. Oh my gosh, whoa. I thought the discussion about incentives was super fascinating. And you sort of alluded to this when you spoke about like not everyone necessarily wants to participate in every little decision. And I have two kind of questions along with that. One is, right now when you're talking about being super intentional, it seems like you have a core group of people who like really care about the mission. As this expands, how do you kind of keep this from being sort of like becoming more short-term focused instead of long-term focused as you are now, and becoming more like maybe risk averse instead of bold like you are now? It seems like a lot of corporations go through this thing where there's the founder, it's super intentional, and then like 20 years down the line, it becomes, like a shadow of what it used to be. And curious what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
I would say focus on a small core group of people that are passionate about the project. As soon as you start to fill it with a bunch of people that might not be interested or fully involved, then you're going to start to hit a lot of roadblocks and everything's going to start to stall out. So you really have to build it with a core group early.
One of the things that I find interesting about LLCs is that you have the concept of an operating agreement. And as you become more algorithmic, you can actually build into the operating agreement the mission of the enterprise. And that's sort of what actually Vanguard did in a sort of non-digital way. And that is what we're looking at, is actually having, is it not 100% algorithmic, but there's some really AI techniques out there that are quite good, that are new, that allow you to actually design something that intentionally achieves certain goals and measures itself against that. To me, the big problem with the current economic system is it creates negative externalities. You make a big mess, it privatizes it, and then you go to the public goods to clean it up. The public good sector gets captured by the private sector. So why not build something that, by its very nature, does not do that? And so that is the architecture really is the policy of the system. And the extent to which you can encode that, put that on chain, and make that as explicit as possible and as accountable as possible into real data, then I think you're able to hold something on course for a long period of time.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what both of them said. On top of that, I mentioned that advisory committee. I mentioned keeping mission aligned. It all depends on what the DAO wants to accomplish at the end of the day, right? And so, yeah, I think it's a design statement. I think it's systems architecture. I think it's human capital. These are not sexy, but they're real in how do you manage people, how do you build community in a sustainable way. And I think that we can look for lessons outside of the private sector. I think we can look to lessons from, as I said, kind of like the co-op model or the community organizing model of electoral politics or the community organizing model of activists. I think there's lessons there how to build a grassroots movement and have people be engaged from a mission perspective that allows you to be more sustainable. And you can put in safeguards like an advisory committee who has veto power to make sure that you don't veer completely off track, considering, depending on your architecture and who's in your community.
Well, that's fantastic. Unfortunately, I think that's all the time we have, but there's always this continued conversation about public goods that exist within DAOs. So thank you all very much. Very
Thank
exciting
you.
conversation.
Thank
So
you.
please give you a round of applause.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.